Ladies and gentlemen, as I said, you're all very, very welcome this evening. And this evening's talk is to deal with crowd crush disasters when event management goes wrong. Again, my thanks to Philip and the Midlands region for the opportunity to present to you this evening. First of all, just a standard disclaimer in relation to the topic itself. The views, etc., expressed tonight are solely my own and not necessarily of any organisation or indeed my employer. So moving on for the motivation for this presentation, why did we actually decide, or why did I actually decide that this was actually worth presenting in the first place? Well, first of all, we have to acknowledge the success of event management in Ireland, and indeed the constant need for upskilling and training amongst technical professionals working in the field, as well as for those working in the periphery of event management itself. Secondly, we have to look at the recent publication of the Local Government Managers Association Guidance of Event Management Guideline and Handbook that was published last year in July of 2022, replacing the department's old Green Book. More about that later. But also as well that this is a topical issue in the media itself. And why is it topical? Well, just two examples here on the screen for you. On the 20th of May, this year, there was a major incident in San Salvador where a stadium with a capacity of approximately 44,000 experienced a crowd crush event, resulting in 12 dead and approximately 100 injured. More recently, in August of this year, we had the opening of the Indian Ocean Island Games in Madagascar. Again, a crowd crush event occurred in a stadium of approximately 50,000, and with a capacity of 50,000. Which resulted in 12 dead and 85 injured. So I'd like you to put those figures in your brain for a moment, because we're going to discuss those very, very shortly. So again, as we said, in stadia with approximately a capacity of between 44,000 and 50,000 people, we're looking at, should a crowd crush event occur, we're looking at approximately 12 dead and approximately 100 injured. Just bear those figures in mind. You'll see why in a second. A brief overview of the talk itself is very, very straightforward. We're just going to be looking at what indeed are crowd crush disasters, why are these relevant, and some recent examples. We're going to look at some underlying theory. Trust me, this won't be too technically difficult, but it will be interesting. Some fundamental considerations, the concept of crowd turbulence, and indeed the dim ice risk modeling tool. And finally, recommendations for event management and potential measures to prevent crowd crush events occurring. I think that's basically it. So when we're talking about events, these are the ones that we're kind of most frequently come to mind, weddings, celebration events, and so on and so on. That's really not the area we're going to be looking at this evening. What instead we're going to be looking at are these, the larger scale events. For example, on the left, you can see the Garwood concerts that took place in Dublin last year. Of course, last year's National Ploughing Championships, which are currently being repeated yet again in Ratheniska this year, and of course Electric Picnic, which we're all very, very familiar with and is part of the Irish staple of annual entertainment. Giving a kind of Webster's dictionary definition of what an event is, an event can be defined as something that occurs in a certain place at a certain time for a certain duration and a certain purpose. It's a very generic description, but it covers things quite well. We must acknowledge, of course, that frequently large concentrations of people occur in modern society, and many of these large gatherings occur without any serious incident. Just to give you a rough oversight of the kind of capacity, and there is, by the way, before somebody pointed out, an error in relation to the capacity of the RDS in Dublin. It's amazing. When this thing was proofread by three of my colleagues, they didn't pick it up, and neither did I. So I think all of us share the blame on this. But again, looking at the figures on the top three events, which are correct, the National Ploughing Championships will host approximately 300,000 people over 3 days. Croke Park in Dublin has a capacity of over 82,000 people, and Electric Picnic in Stradbally, County Laois, caters for 70,000 people on an annual basis. If you put those figures into perspective, say for example here in Westmeath, our population is currently 90,000 people, based on the last census. So you can appreciate, that, you know, the equivalent of Croke Park is effectively the population of County Westmeath, give or take. Moving on, the safety pyramid. Sure, any of us who have been dealing with health and safety are familiar with this concept. But the safety pyramid is a very, very well-established theoretical tool. It has existed since the 1940s and has been further developed in the 1960s. So what is safety? Well, safety is defined as the absence of danger to a known or acceptable degree. That's Bauman's definition, and I think it's a fairly accurate one. Statistically, using the safety pyramid, there is one fatality for every 100,000 people at an event. And the safety pyramid, as I said, developed in 1941 and further developed in the 60s, tells us that accidents are caused by unsafe acts, unsafe conditions, and are avoidable. And I think that is very, very true of any of us that have been involved in the health and safety arena. But here's the rub. We said there a moment ago that according to the safety pyramid, that one fatality will occur in every 100,000 people at an event. But we saw in the two examples presented to you a moment ago that we had capacities of events, or in stadia in particular, between 44,000 and 50,000, where we saw a resulting 12 dead and approximately 100 injured. So it begs the question then, is the safety pyramid a theoretical or a sound theoretical basis to look at event management? And indeed, based on other events and other catastrophes that have occurred at various events, one could argue the validity that no, it's actually it's not conservative enough. Some basic principles of crowd safety and event management are, first of all, it's a practice based on, first of all, understanding the causes of disasters, and secondly, preventing them from reoccurring. Secondly, by improving planning, licensing, and management of events, we can ensure that our events and our stadia are managed as safely as possible. And finally, by understanding liabilities, we also understand the potential for future accidents. Now, we were discussing this before we kicked off the meeting this evening, and indeed the presentation as well, and I was congratulated for the first Technicolor picture of Titanic. But to look at Titanic itself, we all know the story. Between the 14th and 15th of April, 1912, 1,500 people lost their lives as a result of the Titanic. And the reason why I use this example is because it was used by Professor Marcel Altenberg at a talk back in May of this year to explain event management. And he said, why did the Titanic sink? And why did 1,500 people lose their lives? And he had various answers. And he says he had heard them up before. He says the funniest answer he ever heard why 1,500 people lost their lives in the disaster was because Kate Winslet hadn't a big enough door to rescue them all on. But that aside, he raised a very valid point. Everyone knows that the ship hit Titanic, that it had a lack of vertical compartmentation on board itself that allowed spillover of water into adjacent compartments, which has resulted in the ship sinking as rapidly as she did. But he said, really, Titanic is a metaphor, and a very, very clever metaphor for design. The reason why Titanic sunk, and we all know that, is because she hit an iceberg. But the reason why 1,500 people lost their lives is because there weren't sufficient lifeboats on the ship for the actual number of people on board. And he said it's a metaphor. Titanic represented the height of engineering design. And because the engineers who designed the ship were so sure of her invincibility, that really lifeboats were superfluous to need. So the point he was making is that as we as engineers, or indeed professionals working in the sector, if we're so confident about our design and we're so locked in to what we're doing, it really forces us, or indeed can condition us, to exclude the potential of particular incidents occurring that may have a potential significant loss of life. Is everybody okay with that so far? Okay, nobody's asleep in the room just yet, and I hope you're all equally awake online. For those that haven't seen it, this is what the LGMA guidance published last year looks like. It's just a standard document that replaces the Green Book. It should be noted, and this was thanks to a colleague of mine in Offaly, who raised this very valid point, that should an event go wrong, or indeed is a cause for concern, that the Fire and Rescue Service, and this is speaking on a professional basis, working in the area, has no statutory responsibility for event management. If an event isn't licensed, and there are numerous of them, for example, agricultural shows, Tullamore being probably the most famous in the Midlands, which attracts approximately 60,000 people to it every year, or indeed a large sports event, if it's unlicensed, there are no powers technically to stop it. We also are very, very conscious about getting people into events. We're not necessarily that concerned about getting people out. And that's really something that I thought we would address during this talk itself. Under the Council of Europe Disability Action Plan 2015, it requires event managers and indeed various venues, whether they be concert venues or in sports venues, to go beyond the traditional approach of improving access via ramps or elevators. It requires looking at accessibility over and above what we consider as physical disability. It includes making use of closed captioning for those who are hard of hearing or are hearing impaired, to have contrasting colors for those that are visually impaired, and also as well the improvement and use of tactile indicators to identify where changes of level may occur for those, again, who are visually impaired. As I said, there are other sources of information in this field, and as I said, this is really a whistle-stop tour through the topic of event management. To the very, very left, you will see the Code of Practice for Safety at Indoor Events, the old Green Book by the department, which has now been superseded by the LGMA guidance. To the top right, you will see the logo of the Event Industry Association of Ireland, which provides a lot of guidance on their website. The book on the second to the left is The Introduction to Crowd Science by Keith Still, which is taken as the basic academic tone, or indeed, if anyone wants to do any reading around the topic, this book really covers it. And the blue book on the very, very far right is the Applied Crowd Science book, again by Keith Stills, which is basically volume 2 of the book itself. The green book in the middle is the most interesting if one is dealing with crowd safety around sports events. It's the UK guidance, affectionately called, naturally enough, the Green Book. And it is the guidance to sports events and sports stadium in the UK. It is available for download online. And I think at last reckoning, I think it was coming in at around 79 or 80 euro, sorry, 79 or 80 pounds sterling to actually download. But again, it is out there. And if you are looking at large scale sports events or indeed hosting events in sports stadium, it is in a very, very good reference to have. Looking at some recent international examples, last year, of course, was one of the highlights for when things go wrong, they go badly wrong. And this is it, the 28th of May last year, where we had the European Champions Cup final between Liverpool and Real Madrid, held in Saint-Denis in Paris. And the reason why I chose this example is because, naturally enough, Saint-Denis is playing host to the World Cup rugby this year and will be the stadium to host the actual final itself. For those of you that don't know Saint-Denis, Saint-Denis is a custom-built stadium on the outskirts of the city of Paris. It was constructed by the French when they hosted the World Cup back, I think, in 1998. But moving back to the event itself and what happened last May, as you can see in the top paragraph, crowd control descended into absolute chaos on the entrance to Stade de France prior to the beginning of the match. By 9 o'clock local time, the originally scheduled kickoff time, thousands of seats remained empty at the Liverpool end. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, why did this occur in a purpose-built stadium constructed for the 1998 FIFA World Cup with a capacity for 80,000 people? Well, there are numerous reasons for this particular event in Paris, and indeed what became known as a near miss in the subsequent investigation by FIFA. First of all, the possible causes for the issues that occurred with admitting Liverpool fans were, first of all, that this wasn't the first choice stadium. The match was supposed to be held in Italy. And because the venue was changed, there was insufficient time to formulate an event plan. Then, of course, we have the phenomena of British football fans. As you can appreciate, if you're a UK team going to Europe, if you're any team playing in any country in Europe, there's a certain ring of steel of security that's placed around the venue itself. When British teams are welcomed into Europe to play football, there is a tightening of that ring of steel, or indeed, as I always say, a reinforcing of that ring of steel by the local police. Because this was a hosting of a British football team versus a Spanish football team, there was a very, very strict policing regime adopted by the Parisian police. which led to significant changes in how the venue was actually managed. And of course, we have to remember as well that since the stadium was constructed in 1998, the world has changed since 9/11, and indeed Saint-Denis itself was the site of anti-terrorist attack during between the years 2015 and 2017. So there is an increased vigilance in the area itself because, as I said, the world is not as it was back in 1998. What happened, of course, is legendary, and indeed you can read about it at length on the net. But basically, it's a case of Liverpool fans were left stranded outside the venue despite the fact they had valid tickets for the match. As a result of this, Liverpool FC, as you can see from the headline here on the left, called for UEFA to do the right thing after the Paris report findings. UEFA looked into it and, of course, were blamed for the events that unfolded in the Stade de France. And the French police themselves were heavily criticised for their role in what was deemed to be a near miss. The concluding and the shocking thing about it is that it is remarkable that nobody lost their lives, the inquiry concluded, and you'll see why in a moment. Most recently, in Halloween of last year, we had the Halloween Stampede in Seoul. Again, it's worth pointing out that this was not an organized, licensed, or managed event, but 149 people lost their lives, most of them teenagers and in their late 20s. 65 were injured, and of course, 19 of these were quite seriously injured. But you will notice the response from the rescue services, indeed, and the police personnel in Seoul. 1,700 police and emergency service were mobilized to deal with the event. Now, the reason I included this was, first of all, to show this is probably one of the most, it was one of the largest events that resulted in one of the largest losses of life in recent times. But the reason I included this is because it is unlicensed and it's unmanaged. But it also demonstrates as well the simple fact that these events can be so easily organized these days, not just these events, but events like them, in the sense that we are now living in a flash mob generation, an era of social media influencers. So it's quite simple to organize something at very, very short notice in a city or in a suburb of a city where there isn't sufficient capacity, that it is unlicensed and unpoliced. It can happen quite rapidly. And the results of it being unmanaged, unlicensed, or indeed disorganized results and can result in a significant loss of life and injury. Other examples, international examples of disasters between 2010 and 2023, I just chose them at random. The one that was kind of very, very famous and indeed was pointed out by Marcel Landsberg during the talk was the 2010 Love Parade in Duisburg in Germany. 21 dead, 540 injured, where you had crowd densities up to and including 9 people per square meter, where you had the phenomena of lift and move, where you're no longer in control, you've no longer individual control of your own motion, where you're actually physically lifted, and I'm not a light man as it is, but lifted and carried without your own control or consent. It is a scary environment to find yourself in, as you can imagine. The 2014-2015 New Year celebration in Shanghai, if anyone's familiar with Shanghai, this is the Bund. You're looking across the water and you have the Shanghai TV tower on the far side of the river itself, and you have a series of fireworks going on behind. As you can see, crowd densities from the picture in the foreground is quite high. 36 dead, 46 injured. And probably one that people don't know about, again, was a feature of the talk itself, occurred on the 3rd of June in Turin, Italy. As you can see, a group of football fans gathered together in the town main square to watch a football match. Nothing untoward there. Density is, fairly okay. You can see there's avenues and ways in and out. It looks very, very well patrolled and policed. Somebody let off some firecrackers. 3 firecrackers were left off. Somebody thought, or rumors spread through the crowd, that there were shots being fired. Panic ensued. 3 dead, 1,672 people injured, 7 of them seriously. 7 people that were seriously injured were caught against the crowd control barriers. Their feet were trapped underneath the barrier themselves. The 7 seriously injured resulted in amputation of the limbs themselves. They were so badly broken. Again, these things can happen, do happen, and have happened. It's just these things are something we should be aware of. Crowd crush disasters. Well, as we saw from the various examples, a combination of inadequate facilities and deficient crowd management results in injury or death. This is, as I said, crowd crush disaster 101. Research has shown that crowd crush events aren't caused by mass panic, but by people who find themselves in a dangerous situation and often don't realize anything is wrong until it's far too late. Crowd misbehaviour, which has always been commonly held as being one of the primary causes of crowd disasters, have been proven by international research as not being a contributor to a crowd crush occurring. It is really caused by a systematic failure of the event organisers to provide a safe environment for places of public assembly. That's what the research indicates to us. There are 5 general categories of events where crowd crush disasters have occurred: in the field of entertainment, education, in religious scenarios, in retail and shopping, and sports. And I was asked recently, well, why retail and shopping? Well, if you've ever seen the video footage from Black Friday or Black Monday or whatever it is, you can see that people do lose their on themselves to save $200 on their widescreen TV, and mass panic can ensue. Again, putting this on a global scale, we can see that in red, we have the crowd crush disasters associated with religious practice. But I really want you to concentrate on the purple and the green, which show where entertainment events and sports events have led to crowd crush disasters. And as you can see, they're centered on, as you would expect, Europe, North America, South America, and indeed in the Far East. I think 2 notable omissions from that 5 categories are, first of all, in the area of travel and aviation. These are the scenes from Dublin Airport last year. And as you can see, while the density is high, it was a miracle that nobody was actually crushed, or indeed that there wasn't a surge of people to actually make their flights. It was, I think, by the grace of God, that something didn't really happen there. I think the DAA got incredibly lucky. Equally, another notable omission is in the area of humanitarian response. This is just a still taken from Ukrainian nationals moving across the border and being welcomed on the frontier with Poland. I was talking to colleagues in Poland at a seminar there at the height of the Ukrainian crisis, and one town on the eastern border of Poland, one fire officer and local authority were dealing with 80,000 people presenting themselves from Ukraine a day. Logistically, think about it. If you have a bus, it'll take approximately 50 people. So just factor up the number of buses you will have just coming into a town, just to transport the people who are arriving at your border and to transport them elsewhere. The logistics are just mind-blowing. But again, that just shows what we're dealing with in a modern world. Again, sometimes you hate to be proven right, but this is a case where, as I said in relation to the last category, looking at humanitarian responses and where things can go wrong. When they go wrong, they can go badly wrong. This is taken from Sana'a in Yemen. As you know, Yemen has been battling or having an internal battle of a civil war sponsored by the Saudi Arabian government and others. And this crowd crush occurred in a surge for Ramadan donations. And I was asked by somebody last week, why did this occur? And I said 2 things: poverty and hunger. They're fantastic drivers. 78 were killed, 77 injured, and 13 in a critical condition because crowds who have nothing were celebrating the end of Ramadan and celebrating the holy festival of Eid, and decided to take benefit from the free food and cash that was out there. And as a result, there was a surge and many people lost their lives and were injured. Okay, we've looked at some examples of international things, but I think of international events and indeed international catastrophes. But I want to bring it closer to home and really look at the baseline for all of our theories and studies in relation to the whole issue around crowd crush disasters. Take you back to 15th of April 1989 to a semi-final between Liverpool and Notts Forest. And this is, of course, the Hillsborough disaster. If you just look here on the slide on the immediate left and look at the timeline, please. As you can see, at 10 to 3 o'clock being kickoff time, the pens number 3 and number 4 pitch side were full. And these are the days before collapsible fencing. So this was a case where you had a full perimeter wire fence running the perimeter of the actual soccer pitch itself. Because of the pressure at gate C on the middle of your screen, the police in the UK decided to open the gate. Yeah, decided to open the gate. And at 3 o'clock, the crowds came in. The match kicks off at 3 o'clock and there's a crush in pen 3. Look at the timestamp on this. At 11 minutes past 3, this is what happened. Time taken, 21 minutes. Again, looking at it on a larger scale, the photograph here on the immediate bottom left shows the access point to pens 3 and 4. Again, as you can see, sectionally through the actual stand itself, it's a very, very tight blue box leading on to the pitch itself. And the reason why it's culturally significant and indeed forms the opinions of many of us working in safety and indeed in event management is that 96 people, men, women, and children, lost their lives that day. And some people would say needlessly. Again, a bad decision. So, underlying theory, what do we have to look at? Well, this won't take terribly long, and I promise I won't dwell on the maths too very, very long. When we're normally looking at evacuation modeling, we usually use a fluid dynamic model, something like this, where we have a relationship between flow, the pedestrian density, and the average velocity. And it's often used as the formulation for pedestrian and evacuation analysis. Unfortunately, when we're dealing with crowd disasters and indeed large crowd densities, we're not looking at these figures at all. These are not the equations that we need to use. Crowd behavior analysis is decidedly more complex than just simple physics. In fact, it is a combination of physics and biology, where we have, from a psychological perspective, collective motion, emergent behavior, certain biases and thinking. And also as well, we can use computer analysis from the physics end of it to look at how we can actually analyze crowd behavior, or at least try to predict it. We have to look at a number of various factors in relation to the crowd itself. For example, are we looking at a static crowd? Or are we looking at a dynamic crowd? What volume is the crowd? What is the density of the crowd? The average speed of motion? Other psychological and social factors. For example, we may be hosting, like, let's look at the French game, for example. The French were hosting the Champion Cup final between English-speaking fans and Spanish-speaking fans in a city that speaks predominantly French. So how are you going to communicate a message in relation to evacuation, herding people in, etc., etc.? Just the physical management of it. You have all those things to worry about. There are other issues that are involved in relation to managing these kind of events. You'll see, if you read the theory and indeed the literature, you will see topics coming up like lane formation, oscillations of bottlenecks, clogging at exits, high density crowds, crowd shockwaves, and indeed crowd collapse. And these latter topics of high density crowds, crowd shockwaves, and crowd collapse are very, very interesting to watch. And I will give you a link to a YouTube video that you can play, and you can see how shocking these things are. Going back to Hillsborough, question you have to ask yourself: was it a static or dynamic crowd? What was the volume like? What was the density of the crowd? What was the average speed? Were there sociological, psychological, and social factors at play there? Yes, there was. Was there lane formation? Was there a bottleneck issue? Was there clogging at exits? Was there a high density crowd? Was there a crowd shockwave or a crowd collapse? These are the kind of things, these are the questions that you would ask yourself when back analyzing an incident like Hillsborough. So let's look at the whole issue around static and dynamic crowds. Well, let's look at, this is just a static crowd, for example. So you can have, as you can see here on the grid, you have reading from left to right, 1 person per square meter, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So at 4 people per square meter, the only way you can describe this is any of us that have been to London at rush hour, it's going to work on the tube, or bringing it back home, it's going to work on the Lewis. You're tightly packed. It doesn't feel comfortable, as some colleague of mine who was living in London described it as you're going to work in somebody else's armpit. But it basically doesn't feel comfortable. It is quite difficult to move through the crowd because of that. But you're psychologically prepared to accept that density, even though it's uncomfortable and it doesn't feel intuitively comfortable for you. And the reason is because your brain takes over and says, okay, you're on this stop from, say, Houston to Jervis. You're only on there for a couple of stops and you're off. So you can tack this, or you're on the tube and you have 5 more stops and then you're at work, or you have 5 more stops and then you're at home. You can take it for a short period of time. You recognize it's not technically safe in one sense. It doesn't feel comfortable or intuitively correct, But again, you can tolerate it because you can anticipate that it's for a short duration. One person per square meter is, of course, this is, you're walking in the countryside. It's, what you would expect for a fireworks display where people can actually flex back and arch their back and look at the sky, etc. It's the other extreme. It's the low density with massive ease of movement. There's no restriction there. And indeed, you're at the very, very kind of green end of the curve. Optimally, this is where most people will play at when you're looking at event management at 3 people per square meter. It's the most popular weighting. People are still able to move through the crowds, as you can see from the central panel. There is still sufficient space for allowing people to move over and back. So again, this forms the basis for optimal design for crowd dynamics and indeed crowd statics. I included this slide, again, thanks to Marcel Altenberg for explaining this, the difference between a static crowd and a moving crowd. On the left, you have people who are just standing there. As you can see, 1 person per square meter and 2 people per square meter. You have quite a significant amount of void there to allow people to get past them. Now look at the difference if those people are moving. Look at the available space they're taking up. Look at the lack of space that's available. As you can see, if people are moving, then they require a lot more space. So the learning point from this is a moving crowd requires a lot more space than a static crowd does. What's crowd turbulence? Well, crowd turbulence is basically an explanation of how crowds work. And the underlying thing is that physical forces are more likely to cause crowd crush tragedies due to this phenomenon called crowd turbulence. So what is crowd turbulence? Crowd turbulence is really looking at the density of people in a crowd themselves. And I think this graph below will kind of hit home to all the engineers in the room itself. As I said to you in the previous slides, as a density in the middle of 3 people per square meter, you're really at the optimal flow. And if you are to the left of that, at lower densities, of course, there isn't really an issue. It's really when you go beyond a capacity or a density of 3 people per square meter that things go decidedly wrong. Average densities of 6 people per square meter and local densities can reach up to 9 people per square meter. We're assuming as engineers and indeed as professionals in the area that density is uniform. Density is never uniform in a crowd. You could have groups or clumps of people gathered together. And if you don't think that's possible, think of this situation and scenario. If you were there with your partner and you have a number of children, you have 2 in your arms or maybe 1 in your arms, your partner has 1 in your arms, and there's other 3 or 4 probably holding on to your legs, you can appreciate that you have over 6 people or kind of upwards on 6 people per square meter, depending on the event. And that event could be, of course, a fun fair event, or it could be something like Euro Disney. But you can see that at extreme densities, even at extreme densities of 6 people per square meter, you can get movement of up to 18 meters per square minute, which is quite slow. As I said, the optimal density is 3 people per square meter, and this predicates how we calculate egress and ingress into various stadia. For example, there's a kind of magical figure of 82 people per meter per minute if you have a crowd density of 3 people per square meter. In other words, if you had a door that's 1 meter wide and you had a crowd density of 3 people per square meter, then you can optimally, and I use that word caution, optimally expect, 82 people to come through that door. Conversely, and it's intuitively correct, if you have a higher density, say for example 4 or 5 people per square meter, what ends up happening is you get a clogging at the door itself where people cannot flow through, and as a result, you have the exits being used inefficiently. However, if we go beyond the magical 6 people per square meter and we go in excess of 7, as you can see from the graph, we're now in a situation where we don't have individual flow anymore. You're now having a phenomenon where the crowd is moving en masse, and where it is basically a case of almost like a crowd function where individuals are no longer in charge of their own motion. It's basically, I won't say herd mentality, but it's basically a block of people moving in unison together with nobody in control. And with these particularly high densities, you can see, as I said, this phenomena of compression shock waves rippling through a crowd. In other words, where a shock wave can actually travel through a crowd, come to a stage area, and that will be reflected back into the crowd itself, resulting in people losing their footing and resulting in injury. If you don't, just to summarize, if you're on this side of the graph on the immediate left, it's free flowing. It's really nothing to worry about. At 3 people per square meter, you're really at capacity levels. And anything beyond that, you're into a congested zone where you will not make full use of the available exits and entries that are there. Putting it into color, again, as I said, if you're on the left of the 3 people per square meter, you're into a stable and free-flowing environment. If you're at 3 person per square meter, you're really at the capacity, the design capacity of the venue. If you're over that, whether you're standing or moving, you're dealing with an unstable or congested environment, and you are now really in the red zone. I think that graphic brings it all back home. If you want to have a look at something, I would advise you to go to this website and to this actual, excuse me, I'll just go back on that. Go back to that video shot itself. Everything that I've explained badly in the last few minutes or so will be done by somebody with a fantastic American accent who is far more eloquent than I am, but again, covers the phenomena of compression flows and reflected compression flows within the crowd itself. And when you see it, it is genuinely shocking. How we deal with those as planners and indeed event managers is by using one of many tools. CCTV, of course, is a massive, massive help in the sense that you can train staff to identify crowd densities based on CCTV footage. But in absence of that, and indeed subsidiary to that, you can use various modeling tools to help you police the event, for want of a better word. And one of the tools that's used is the dim ice risk modeling tool, again, developed by Keith Still, the guy whose books I showed you at the very start of this. The risk model considers 3 fundamental categories of systematic failure, and these are applicable to all crowd-related events. And these include design, information, and management. In other words, how you design the event, what information flow you have there, and indeed how you actually manage it. It's intuitively correct. It also assesses categories and 3 identified phases of crowd movement, and it's common sense. Ingress, what they do on their arrival, how you actually get them into the venue. Circulation, how they actually behave and how they move within the venue itself. And finally, egress, how you actually get them out of the event. So again, as I said, it's quite intuitive. So recapping, it looks at the design, it looks at the quality of information that you have out there to your audience, and it also addresses the issue of how you manage the actual event itself. You're looking at how you get people in, how you cope with them moving around the place, and indeed how you get them out. And the model itself is very, as I said, intuitive and combines these into a matrix. The model itself was developed from analysis and back analysis of incidents around the world. It uses evidence-based mathematical formula and direct interactions on a risk causality-based approach. And for those that didn't know what causality is, I just included it there in the slide. But it can also be used to identify the multiple and indeed complex issues around crowd safety by taking into account, as I said, crowd density, crowd behavior, and indeed the dynamic of the crowds themselves, which aren't necessarily apparently obvious. The dim ice modeling tool, as it said here, breaks the process down into 2 distinct formats. On the immediate left, in green, you have, of course, normal events. In other words, when everything is running smoothly, you're looking at the design of getting people in, how you actually design for how they mobilize around the event, and indeed how you get them out. What information are you going to provide them as they're coming into the event? In other words, where is stall K? Where is the seat number, etc., etc.? How do they circulate? How do you direct them? How do you move them along? Do you have signage? Do you have staff? How do you do that? And indeed, how do you get them out? And indeed, once they're there, how do you manage them? How do you police them? How do you ensure? Do you have security checks in place? Do you actually have alcohol flows? Do you have lots of fun? Do you have special tools to deal with mobility impaired people, and so on and so on. And that's fine when you're dealing with it in the normal phase of things, when things are going well. And I've included some examples here. These are just standard extract from the text. But then the eventuality must be catered for when suddenly there is an emergency, suddenly there is something going on at your event. There could be a power cut, there could be a a fault with the fireworks resulting in a fire. There could be a bomb threat. There could be there could be the threat of antisocial behavior. There could be taking it to another level. There could be rival behavior between certain fans of certain football teams. You can see where this is going. You have to cater for that eventuality. And again, the modeling tool comes into itself in that, in the sense that you design and you consider what can go wrong, how you, say, for example, getting people in, how you get them around the building, how you get them out, what information are you going to provide to them in this particular phase, and indeed, how you're going to manage it yourself, because your management structure is going to change dramatically from dealing with a normal event, inverted commas, event, to something that is a little bit more life-threatening. So that's it, ladies and gentlemen. Some general conclusions. Just to recap, crowd crush disasters themselves are complex events where normal evacuation modeling rules do not apply. Research has indicated that disasters have both a physical and a psychosocial component. All disasters involve large numbers of people in the area where the local topography and indeed the escape route design contribute to the issue. And we can think back to the events in Seoul. Some of the street widths in downtown Seoul are approximately 2 meters. So if you think about it, our standard footpaths are 2 meters from wall to curb. Some of the streets, as in wall to wall, are 2 meters. So you can appreciate if there was a surge of people going down there, as I said, both bottlenecks occurring and indeed clogging, you can appreciate if all people were heading down it to a particular street at a particular time, it will lead to the whole thing becoming clogged and then people being trampled underfoot. Again, there's not just a need to consider the event stadia itself where the event is taking place, but the perimeters and the precincts around the stadia event site. Colleagues in Italy take a very, very holistic view in relation to event management. And one can say a lot about Italian management, but in relation to event management, they have a very, very holistic view in that they prioritize things over 10 headings. And what they do is they look at the venue and they look at 500 meters, it's just a circle around 500 meters around the venue itself. And they say, okay, what do we have in that area? Do we have schools, public buildings, libraries, parking, whatever? And they look at the various things that could be impacted and may be impacted by the actual hosting of the event itself. And then the design accordingly for that, not just for the event and getting people in the door per se, but what happens on the run up to getting people in the door. I was talking to a colleague of mine in Mayo and we're discussing McHale Park and Mayo football finals and Connacht finals, etc., etc. And I was explaining to him, I says, what is it like driving to McHale these days? Oh, he says, it's a disaster. He says, there's cars everywhere. You really can't go anywhere. And I says, right. I says, and that's just in the run up to the venue, not the actual park itself. This is on the perimeter of it. So I said, suppose if something goes wrong, how do you actually get people in? And more importantly, how do you get people out? And that kind of brings it all home to you at a local level. Again, as I pointed out in the presentation, disasters may be prevented by a holistic approach involving modeling and event management. And it's incredibly important that communication is adequate to the audience you have. This slide, I included it. I'm proud to say I'm a Generation X, that I'm born between 1965 and 1980, and I'm quite comfortable communicating using text and email. But if you're dealing with millennials or indeed Gen Z, they have different methods of communication. So you have to be communication savvy to the audience that you want to reach. For example, Gen Zs respond to online face-to-face interaction, as in the personable approach. And that has also, as event managers, implications for you in terms of the staff training you're providing and the number of staff you have on the venue. Millennials communicate through social media and text. And we're assuming that all of these are working quite well. But we all know that in the event of a disaster occurring, the first casualty is usually the social media networks and the broadband wireless and everything else that is out there. They just reached capacity. We've seen that in Manchester, we've seen that elsewhere. So again, it may not be possible to communicate using social media or indeed electronic devices. So we have to consider something else. Again, looking at back analysis of various events, and most recently the Manchester Arena bombing, communications not alone by the responding emergency services, but in how the event, how the disaster was communicated to the audience was heavily criticized in the actual subsequent reports to it. So again, it basically, communications will become the metric by which your success or otherwise of managing the event is based. Finally, thank you very, very much for your attention. As our friends here say, you can clap if you want to, but I wouldn't advise it. We're in an online platform. And if you, of course, you have any questions, my friend Google will answer them, but I'll also try my level best. So thank you all. Thank you for your attention. So now I think it's time to open the floor up to questions.
Let's start. Can we be heard? Yeah, I'll start, Paul. That was fabulous and real insight there, and a new appreciation for crowd control. There's one question comes to mind: where would the responsibility lie for an event that was unmanaged and or unlicensed?
Generally, the licensing process kicks in at events over 5,000 people. So say, for example, if you wanted to circumvent the licensing process, it's quite ethical to do it, saying that your anticipated numbers are going to be 4,999 people, and you will still circumvent the process. Like it is very much a case. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not condoning that practice, but it is permissible to do that under the legislation. But the licensing kicks in at over 5,000. So once you exceed 5,000, 5,001, you're now into the whole licensing end of things. So that involves dealing with the local authority in relation to event management, preparing an event management plan, dealing with the concerns raised by the HSC, the local authority staff, and ourselves and the fire service and so on. But there is that kind of input in relation to it. But answering the point, the big risks, and that's the reason why I threw up the issue around the South Korean incident, is that it's my personal opinion that that's the area we're going to find ourselves playing in as our young people are becoming more and more enabled and influenced by social media, that it will become, I won't say the growth area, but it will certainly become the area where we're going to see more and more of our young people being put at risk, where these kind of events are going to be put together ad hoc, with no management in place, with no structures in place, and indeed no forewarning to any of the emergency services, arms of the state, whatever you want to call it, which will result in potential loss of life and serious injury. I hope that goes some way to answering it.
So yeah, very interesting, Pat. And yeah, 5,000 then is the number for sporting events, or music events. Yeah, I can see how the flash events would be of concern. Thank you.
Do we have any questions online?
There's one question online.
Okay.
I'll read it out to you, or do you want to read it?
This is from Paul Curran. Hi, Paul. If software is used for the design of normal egress requirements, is it suitable for crowd scenarios you described? The answer to that is, that's a very, very difficult question to answer, Paul, but in a way, if it's a case that you're using software to model evacuation from a crowd scenario, and you're using the exact same software to model evacuation, conventional evacuation from a building, you're really at cross purposes there, because as I said in the slide, the underlying theory for evacuation modeling for standard building is based on a number of tenants. And those are particular densities where you have low crowd densities and so on. If you're dealing with events, you're dealing with substantial densities. And as I said, if you're a designer of events, you're looking at crowd densities of optimally to maximize your exits of 3 people per square meter. So if you're using the same software that you would use to model evacuation from a building and trying to transfer that technology onto modeling for a crowd scenario, it would be extremely unwise to do that. Unless, of course, you are doing or using software that's specifically tailored and using densities that will be suitable for modeling evacuation scenarios from large-scale stadia or large-scale arena.